Ari, Georgia is headed to Oxford. It's going to be a hell of a party, but also a hell of a game because I think we saw the Ole Miss team that we expected to see all season finally against Arkansas, but not necessarily in the way we thought we would because Trey Harris still didn't play. Caden Prescore didn't play, but that offense was virtually unstoppable against a Razorbacks defense that we had seen shut down Tennessee's offense earlier in the season.
Yeah, I mean, putting up 63 points without two players in your offense that are going to be playing very long careers in the NFL is a pretty good sign that things are clicking on all cylinders. And it's especially comforting for Ole Miss to see that after going an entire month without scoring 27 points or more than 27, I should say. So, the funniest thing to me about Ole Miss is that when they looked at their schedule this year and decided that they had a really good window of opportunity to make the playoff if they were to invest in their roster and get a lot of these players to come in, you probably chalked up the Georgia game as a loss and told yourself, well, it's the 12-team era. Georgia's going to be a monster. We won't be able to beat them, but even if we lose to them, we could still get in. But Ole Miss has now lost 2 games that they probably wish they didn't lose to have that breathing room coming into this game. But they could still get to where they thought they were going to go by winning the game that they probably already chalked up as a loss before the year. And I think they have an opportunity to do so because Georgia doesn't look all that great right now. Every other week, it's different with them.
Yeah. It feels like they're deciding when to show up. And against Florida, they decided not to. It was wild. Watching Florida push Georgia around on the line of scrimmage in the fourth quarter of that game was not something I ever would have expected to happen. Carson Beck throwing 3 interceptions. Now, he's had turnover issues this year, but it looked like anytime there's a dirty pocket, he was thrown into coverage. Like, you can't do that against Ole Miss. The pockets are all going to be dirty.
Yeah.
Now, Georgia had some depth issues at running back. They had interior offensive line still, guys coming back from injury, still kind of banged up. But they're going to have to be able to run the ball more effectively, and they're going to have to take care of Carson Beck's going to have to take care of the ball because Ole Miss is going to get after him. Ole Miss's pass rush in the country.
Yeah, it's funny with Georgia. You say they show up sometimes and they don't show up others. The problem for Ole Miss is that Georgia tends to show up for the big games.
Yes.
And I guess to a certain extent, one of their only loss is in a big game. So I guess you can make the case that they didn't show up for the first half of the Alabama game, but when they did show up in that game in the second half, it was an absolute thrilling game. But going on the road to Ole Miss for a team that feels like it's playing for its playoff life, it doesn't feel like it is. And Georgia, if it loses, will be put onto playoff life support. Like, this is about as big of a game as you can imagine. And technically speaking, even though it's been kind of a disappointing year for Ole Miss and they dropped out of the spotlight for a while, being on the field at home against Georgia in a huge playoff scenario type game is where this program envisioned it would be when it made that investment in the offseason.
Well, and it made that investment to specifically compete with teams like Georgia. Now, in the SEC West, they always played Alabama, and Lane Kiffin couldn't beat Nick Saban's Alabama. That was the type of team they were angling toward. But they didn't get Alabama on this schedule. They did get Georgia. They happened to play Georgia last year. And after a good start, the first few minutes of that game looked like it might be competitive. Georgia just put the hammer down on Ole Miss. And it was probably the healthiest Georgia was all season last year. So they probably got the best version of the Bulldogs. But they were so far apart. And it was very clear what they needed to do, that they needed to get better on both lines of scrimmage. So they went out and got your Walter Nolans and your Princely Emmanuelans, and they beefed up that offensive line, even though they had a bunch of returning starters. And this is why you did all that. This is what you paid for. Now it's time to find out if that actually worked, because you are in a do or die situation. You have to win this game to make the playoff. But you got these players to beat this team.
Yeah, I think people thought that Ole Miss got those players to make the playoff. I mean, I think they got those players to try to win the SEC, right? Like that.
Yeah.
They wanted to be good enough to win the SEC. So, coming into this game and the fact that Ole Miss is only a 2.5-point underdog, I think the math will tell you that they were successful in doing it. And I think that it's interesting because in a new era where we are judging coaches less and less because of NIL stuff, like this is when Lane Kiffin has to be the chef here, right? Like they brought
this is
in
where
the
you make your
ingredients.
money if you're Lane Kiffin.
Yeah, like if you're the coach, obviously roster assembly and fundraising and all these things are important for everybody. And even though recruiting has changed and what drives commitments and signees is a little bit different than it was 2 years ago with the money being involved, if you have a program that stepped up and brought you the ingredients, you have to make a good meal. And Lane Kiffin, like it or not, the number one candidate for 4 months or 4 weeks, sorry, after Florida State, 4 weeks after Florida lost in the beginning of the year, it's stranglehold on the notion that it was going to keep Billy Napier. Like, this is a very disappointing season for Lane Kiffin. Like, everybody thought, go get Lane Kiffin, go get the guy who can win big games, go get the guy who knows how to recruit, how to assemble a roster. But if you assemble a roster and then you lose the games that Ole Miss has lost and then you lose to Georgia, it's like, how good of a job did Lane Kiffin do? Right? Like that's a real criticism. And I think he'd probably be honest about that.
It is going to be a just make or break game for both these teams. And I can't wait, but I'm very interested to see how PrizePicks handles the projections for this game, because like, what do you do with Jackson Dart? So PrizePicks, by the way, the best daily fantasy game in America. Use that code STAPLES, and when you sign up, you play $5, you get $50 instantly. I played a $25 play, all demons, on Saturday. I was so close. So a demon square is a little harder to get, but I had a good feeling about team scoring some touchdowns. Kentucky's defense actually played better against Tennessee than I thought they would. So I did not get my Nico Iamaleava rushing or receiving touchdown, but I did get my Dylan Sampson more than 1.5 of those. And Lenora Sellers also scored a rushing touchdown for South Carolina. So I was right there. I was this close. And that's how you play PrizePicks. But like, how are they going to handle Jackson?
That's a great card, Andy. That's a great card.
It was so close because Tennessee had a lot of plays in the red zone where it could have been Nico. But how do they handle Jackson Dart? Because he threw for 500 yards last game. But I think if you watch the film of Georgia and Florida, yeah, you can throw against Georgia, but Florida was having success on the ground. Ole Miss might want to run it more. Like, that might be better for them. And
yeah,
so I don't know how you're going to handle. Like, I think there's going to be a big number on Jackson Dart. I don't know that he necessarily needs to hit that big number to win the game, but we'll see. Download PrizePicks, use code STAPLES, play $5, get $50 instantly. That in the trenches situation, it was so lopsided in favor of Georgia when these two teams played last year. But I was watching the Georgia and Florida game in Jacksonville. It was very difficult to imagine this Georgia team that was in a struggle in the fourth quarter with Florida that was not matching up as well as nearly as well as I thought they would on the line of scrimmage. Like, it's hard to imagine them again winning games like this. But the fact is, we've seen them dominate Texas's offensive line. So which Georgia team shows up?
Yeah. But also too, Ole Miss's defense probably is licking its chops watching Carson Beck fold like a lawn chair under pressure on Saturday night against Florida with the guys they have up front. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that this is a less than a field goal spread is a very encouraging notion, I think, if you are Ole Miss. And I think a lot of people are going to be all over Georgia. I think a lot of people are just going to assume that Lane Kiffin can't win it. But can you imagine how much Ole Miss's season, the discourse around that team is going to change if they end up winning this football game? You might have Ole Miss in projections on the 2 line in the bracketology that you do next week. Like it might be.
Yeah, it changes everything. If they can beat Georgia, it changes everything for them. Meanwhile, if Georgia can beat Ole Miss, it takes a lot of pressure off because Georgia's going to play Tennessee in Athens next week. Like Georgia's schedule has been pretty rough. And if they can win this game, then they go against Tennessee with a mulligan, and then they play UMass and Georgia Tech after that. They need to win this game, because if they don't, the Tennessee game becomes a pressure cooker like you would not believe. So I am very excited about this game in Oxford. We don't know which Georgia team is going to show up. We don't really know which Ole Miss team is going to show up. But if the best version of the two is what we see in Oxford at 3:30 Eastern time on Saturday, we're going to get a hell of a game.
Yeah, I can't wait for this game, and really excited to see too if this new era of college football actually breeds some new contenders, right? Like Ole Miss is the poster child for being the new age roster assembly type program, right? And if that actually works, we already punted on Ole Miss doing it, and it might have been premature. You know, they have an opportunity to win a football game at home that will put them most likely in the playoff and in the SEC race, and that's not a team that has been in that position very often, you know. And you have Alabama, who's on the outside looking in right now on a lot of brackets. You have Georgia, who could suffer its second loss. Texas got beaten by Georgia, and they could lose to A&M, who's a new team that could be like there's a lot of new age situations here that make you, like everybody likes to say, the sport's flattened. It's new teams. Everybody's on the even playing field. It's like, okay, that's great to say in October, but it would be really cool to see a bracket that doesn't have all these same teams in there too. Like, what if Tennessee, A&M, and Ole Miss are the three representatives for the SEC in the big bracket here at the end of the year? Like, that could happen.
It's entirely possible. And this game, Georgia at Ole Miss, old money versus new money, the biggest matchup of old money versus new money since the Great Gatsby.